Hi, I'm Lindsay Reiser. For the fifth consecutive day, U.S. forces began conducting a new wave of strikes against Iran earlier. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said President Trump was, quote, not going to sit by and allow acts of terrorism to take place in the Strait of Hormuz without ensuring Iran pays consequences, end quote. CBS News Pentagon reporter Eleanor Watson is following these developments for us. So what can you tell us about these latest strikes?
Well, what we're seeing, Lindsay, is that these strikes seem to be escalating into what appears to be a limited war, if not the full-blown bombing campaign that we saw earlier this year. This is, as you say, the fifth consecutive day, and the target set is getting wider. They're still mostly concentrating along the Strait of Hormuz, along Iran's coast, to have some leverage over that strait. The strikes in the past few days have hit things like air defense sites, coastal radar sites, and the small speedboats that Iran uses to target shipping in the strait. But it's not just strikes. Remember, the U.S. on Wednesday reimposed the naval blockade, and yesterday disabled non-compliant vessel in the Persian Gulf. That's the first time since this conflict that the U.S. Navy has disabled a vessel inside the Persian Gulf, and the first one it's disabled at all since this blockade was reimposed. Iran, in return, has been retaliating each day. Last night, there were strikes against facilities in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. As far as we know, there's been no damage to the U.S. bases there, but Iran has continued to retaliate, and a spokesperson for their military today said that the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. should not interfere. This is Iran's invincible red line. So it appears, as for right now, there's no end to sight in what seems to be an escalating conflict.
What is the strategy behind consecutive days of strikes? Is it essentially hitting targets as intelligence comes in? Is it hitting a few targets, waiting to see Iran's response, and hitting a few more?
I think consecutive days is keeping it in this limited war process where there's not a full-scale bombing campaign that we saw earlier this year, but it's continuing to strike at Iran's capabilities. We heard from Secretary Hegseth when he was in the Oval Office maybe last week. He was talking with President Trump about continuing to hit Iran hard. And he mentioned that any capability that Iran thinks it's rebuilt, they're going to strike. So it's a combination of hitting things that haven't been hit before, but also hitting things that Iran may have been able to rebuild in this process. And then I mentioned the small speedboats because those are, you know, you think about a river and small speedboats doesn't seem that dangerous, but Iran can really use this mosquito fleet of boats to roll up to commercial shipping, intimidate them at the very least, or try and launch attacks from these speedboats. And so they have a vast inventory of those. So the strikes, while are not super centered on the speedboats, that's an example of a capability that continues to be hit in these ongoing strikes.
Do you have any reporting on what locations could be in the crosshairs next?
Well, President Trump has laid out a few different options. I think what we're seeing right now is they're going after different islands along the coast that Iran can really use to leverage control over the strait, to try and leverage control. Yesterday, they hit an island near Oman, near the Strait of Hormuz, that they've been able to, that Iran's been able to use to control. President Trump himself has mentioned Pickaxe Mountain, which is one of the nuclear sites in Iran's program, or at least connected to its nuclear program. That site wasn't hit last summer when the three other sites were hit, and that's in part, we think, because it's still under construction. That's where they're building, really since 2020, a nuclear centrifuge assembly plant. But there are concerns that they're also within that mountain building a nuclear centrifuge enrichment plant, which would be dangerous. He has mentioned potentially hitting that, warning Iran, hey, watch out, we could hit it. But so far, he says they're looking at it and there might not be a need because it's still under construction.